Hello everyone, I'm Naomi Fisher, and today I'm going to talk about neurodiversity and self-directed education. And the title of my talk is Being Who You Are. And that's because I actually think there's an amazing synchrony between the idea of neurodiversity and the idea of self-directed education. So I've already asked you to say in the chat what brought you here today, and you're coming from all over the world with all sorts of different interests, which is great. I'm going to start off by telling you a bit about myself. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm also the mother of two self-directed learners who have never been to conventional school. They were unschooled for the first 6 years of their kind of schooling time, and then they went to a self-directed school in Paris, and they're now at the Self-Managed Learning College in Hove. Before I had my children, I did a lot of training in psychology. In particular, I did a PhD in autism in 1999 to 2002. And it was a very traditional PhD. And it really definitely wasn't from the perspective that I'm going to talk to you now. I was looking for deficits, and that's how we talked about it. Could somebody mute themselves? Because I've got somebody with background noise. I'm not sure who it is. Is there anyone? Is anyone there who can mute everybody, just so that I haven't got the background noise?
Naomi, if you make me co-host, I can take care of that.
Do it. Okay, unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to stop sharing in order to do that. So I need to make you the co-host. Where do I do that?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm already in.
I haven't done it. Okay, so you are the co-host. Well, that's really weird because I didn't do that, but you are the co-host anyway. It's like it heard me. Okay, great. So could we mute everybody apart from me, just so that I can't hear the background noise? Great. Okay, thank you. Let's go back. So I was saying I did a PhD in autism, and at the time the focus was all on what we call deficits. So it was looking for what is wrong, basically, what is wrong with these children to mean that they behave so differently. I was trying to understand autism in terms of an underlying cognitive problem, what it was that they couldn't do. And to that end, I did a lot of experimental tasks with children in special schools. I've also spent a lot of time, actually not a lot of time, I spent a bit of time. I wasn't able to spend too much time in these places because I actually found them very difficult to work in. I spent time working in neurodevelopmental clinics, diagnosing children with autism and ADHD. So I worked in a London teaching hospital where we had a waiting list of 2 years, and a child would come with their family, and it would be about thinking, okay, we have a list of all the things which people might be able to do and might not be able to do. And we do all sorts of different observations and tests and ask them questions, ask their parents questions to try and put them into categories, the people who can't do things and the people who can. And the assumption is that there are, in quotes, normal people and those with mental disorders. I don't usually use these terms at all. The reason I'm using them here is because they are the diagnostic terms in the manuals. They are the things that the diagnoses are called these things. They class autism and ADHD as neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, before I met these children, as I met more and more of these children, and I met a lot of children because a child came in every day, we did an assessment every day, and I started to wonder about what I was actually doing, because when I listened to the children, the descriptions of what they were saying made me uncomfortable. So one little boy called Sydney told me that he felt he was in a cage at school. Amal told me she couldn't see the point in assembly, and why did everyone have to sit still and listen to boring things? Another little boy told me that when he was at school, he really wanted to move around, but when he got up and moved around during the lessons, he got into trouble. Milena told me she could already read, and she really didn't like sitting there and waiting for everybody else to learn, and why did she have to do that? Jackson told me he hated the playground because when he went out, it was really loud, really busy, and he'd much prefer to sit inside and read in the library, but that wasn't allowed. Reuben told me he knew he was stupid and he'd never be successful because he'd been put in the class for people who weren't going to get good grades in their exams. None of these things they told me are in the diagnostic criteria for what I was looking at. In fact, it was one of the reasons I couldn't stay in that clinic very long, was because I felt like the questions I was asking people seemed so disconnected from the reality of their lives. And what I was offering them was essentially just a diagnosis. That was all we could offer them. They came, we did all these assessments, and we gave them a report at the end. And the report would either say, yes, we think you're autistic. Yes, we think you have ADHD. Yes, we think you have both autism and ADHD, or no, you don't have any of those things. And then we'd send them back, we'd write a long report, and that was that. We never knew what happened next. All these children were so different. And there was so little account of what was going on for them in the context of where they were. And the more I saw the world through their eyes, the harder it was to see them as in any way disordered. They were people who found some environments distressing, and I agreed with them. I also think assembly is a waste of time, for example. I also don't like loud playgrounds full of children running around. Because I'm an adult, I can choose not to do those things. Because they were children, they didn't. They were often people who disliked staying still. I can appreciate that as well. Many people are like that. They were people who didn't like being in large groups of people often. Yeah, I can get with that. They were fundamentally often people who disliked being controlled. And when they told me about their experiences, I could really feel how controlling school felt for them. You see, I'm somebody who did quite well at school. Luckily for me, I meshed with the school environment. I performed academically. I got lots of approval. I didn't have a conscious feeling of being controlled most of the time that I was at school. I would have chosen to go to school. And as I was meeting these children, I was hearing their experiences of the very same thing and how difficult they found it. They were people who didn't like doing the same things as everyone else, and they saw no reason why they should. They were people who were developing in their own time and in their own way. And what we were offering them was, we were telling them they were disordered. I felt increasingly uncomfortable about that. And because I thought particularly they were people who refused to give up on what they knew they needed. Because young children are usually really good at knowing things like, when they've had enough, when they don't want to be with other people anymore, when they need to move their bodies around. And generally our society allows younger children to do that more. As they get older, school becomes more and more controlling. School says, right now, the time for play is over, guys. You're 5. It's time to be sitting down and focusing a bit more. And these were the children who were saying, no, I'm not going to do this. And the way we were responding, and I felt like we were being pulled into this. There was a kind of, because we were in a clinic in a hospital. We didn't go to the schools didn't come and see us, but we were getting pulled into this process from the schools because the schools had this idea. They knew that the children, in order for the children to show that these children really needed help, as opposed to all the other children who might be saying they needed help too, they would send us off to us to get a diagnosis, and the diagnosis would kind of validate the help. It would say, right, this child is genuinely different, they need help. But some of the children would come, and some of the children would be having lots of difficulties quite clearly, but they wouldn't fit the diagnostic criteria. So then we'd be sending them back saying, this child doesn't get a diagnosis, they don't meet this diagnostic criteria. And the parents would often be very angry with us and feel very let down. Understandably, they had waited usually for 2 years for this. And it was kind of held up as, when I get my diagnosis, I'll get help. But the child was exactly the same. We would send back the child with diagnosis, without diagnosis. The child was still the same person. And yet somehow we were using these criteria to divide them into, yes, you need help. Yes, you should be able to get on with it yourself. This is a kind of dilemma that our society repeats. And there's an eminent psychologist called Mary Boyle who talks about this as the brain or blame dilemma. That basically our society says, if you're behaving in a certain way, or if you're, causing concern to those around you, there are only really 2 explanations. Either there's something wrong with your brain, in which case it's not your fault, or it is your fault and you should be doing something differently. And I think schools get into this all the time, because when they tell children they must try harder, or they're lazy, or they tell their parents that they must make their children try harder, what they're going down is the blame route. They're saying this child isn't working hard enough. When you get that diagnosis, it puts you into the brain category. So now you can say, look, I'm different. There's something wrong with me. It's not my fault. What I would like to see is if we could step back from that and say, what if it's nobody's fault? What if really what is going on here is we've got a child and an environment, and the 2 are not working together. This environment does not work for this child in the same way as different environments work for different adults. we don't give children that option. We say school needs to work for everybody. It must work for you. If it's not working for you, it's something wrong with you, not wrong with the environment. So, as I said, when I did my PhD, I came from a very traditional academic perspective. And then as I started to read more about this, I came across the idea of neurodiversity, which is an entirely different way of conceptualizing what are called traditionally neurodevelopmental disorders. Neurodiversity is the idea that human brains are different, and this difference is not a disorder. So the idea of disorder is that there's something wrong, right, that we might need to fix. Whereas the idea of difference is simply diversity, that different people have different things they find hard, they have different things they find easy. That doesn't mean they're disordered. That's something that society puts onto other people. And there's this idea that humans are highly variable, and this variability could actually be a strength if we allowed it space to flourish. Instead, what we're doing is trying to squash it. Or what we're doing is we're kind of siloing off these children and saying, these children are different, therefore, we don't really need to listen to what they're telling us about the system. Because once we've given a child one of these diagnoses, their behavior will be seen in the light of that diagnosis. So, it's really circular. Say you've got a child who can't sit down at school, is moving all the time, can't pay attention, doesn't concentrate for more than a couple of moments. They go off to somebody like me, they get a diagnosis of ADHD, and now it will be, why is it that they can't concentrate at school? Oh, it's because they have ADHD. But they only got that diagnosis of ADHD because they couldn't concentrate at school. The way that we do the assessments is literally a behavioural list. There is no test, there's no blood test, there's nothing. We don't know what this thing means when somebody has ADHD. It's a list, it's a symptom list. And the evidence is that, and this is across mental health general, not just neurodevelopmental, the evidence is that these diagnostic categories are really unreliable and they lack validity. So they don't actually necessarily represent something underneath, something core, but yet we behave as if it does all the time. We behave as if there's something wrong, effectively, which ADHD, for example, names. Actually, it's just a list of how you are. So the core thing about the idea of neurodiversity is that difference is not the same as disorder, but it's also not the same as disability or distress. Difference can lead to disability and distress, but it isn't the same thing. And that's because the disability and the distress comes with the interaction with the person around them. So you have the person who is, getting on with their life, then you have the reactions of everybody around them, and then you may have distress and disability. On a really basic level, if you just think, if no one actually read, before humans invented written language, those people who now find it really hard to learn to read would not have been disabled. They wouldn't have been considered to be disabled. If no one could talk, then actually not being able to talk wouldn't be a disability either. We'd all communicate in different ways. If we don't have age-based expectations, then it wouldn't be seen as a disability if children learnt things in a different time scale. If some children learnt how to read when they were 10, others learnt how to read when they were 3, that wouldn't be a problem. It's only a problem when we put that framework on them. If we didn't have high stakes tests, for example, no one would get anxious about them and there wouldn't be that distress. So there's always this interaction between the two. And this is something that has been traditionally really neglected when thinking about neurodisability, neurodevelopmental differences. Generally, we focus on the person, what is going on in this person. And actually, we haven't been able to find out the things that are going on for these people. So, when I talked about at the beginning of my PhD, where I was looking for deficits, in quotes, no one has managed to find these deficits. We have done hundreds and thousands of studies looking for the core problem in these different diagnoses. Nobody has found them. In fact, the more we look, the more diversity we find. And that even goes on a genetic level. When we look at genes, there's no gene that causes any of these issues. There are thousands of different genes which all interact, which all go to make each unique person. And the interesting thing is, even genes, which people sometimes talk about as being, biological, hardcore biological, they act in interaction with the environment. And there's a lot of evidence that the way that our genes work is the way our genes express themselves is highly influenced by the environment. And then the environment that a person's in is actually also influenced by their genes, which I think is fascinating. So the interactions are two ways. And that makes sense if you think about genes as kind of being characteristics of a person, and which is a bit of an oversimplification in itself. But the characteristics that a person has influence how their environment around them. So just think of two babies. You've got one baby who, for whatever reason, is quite chilled out, sleeps well, does all the things that in the textbook, you know. I remember we had this book called The Baby Whisperer when my children were little, and she basically divided babies into groups, and there's the textbook baby. You have and then there's the tricky baby, I think she called them. She was definitely a slightly, she used pathologizing language. Anyway, those babies will affect the behavior of their parents. If you have a baby who sleeps through the night, you're going to be a different parent to the person who gets the baby who wakes up every 30 minutes. Because it affects you. And in turn, then there's another feedback loop that how you are with that baby then affects how they develop. So that everything is in complex interaction loops the whole time. So this interaction makes the difference really between thriving and misery. And it will be unique to each person and each situation. So much so that I think what somebody might find an absolute nightmare, this would be one of my worst nightmares, to be hanging off a rock like this. But obviously for this guy here, this is something he seeks out to do in his free time. So something that's one person's nightmare can be another person's joy. And that's really the core of this idea of neurodiversity. People are very different, and we need to embrace that difference. The impact, just as I was saying, the impact of environment can never be separated from people. We're always in an environment, we're always acting upon our environment, and we then learn different things due to our environment. One of the examples I often think about when I'm thinking about the interaction between particularly neurodiverse children and their environment, there's a little boy I saw who was getting in a lot of trouble at school, a lot of trouble. I think he'd been isolated for 28 days out of the last term. He's only 9 or 10, still at primary school. He was spending a lot of time sitting in the head teacher's office because they were putting him in school isolation because his behaviour was thought to be so disruptive that he couldn't stay in the classroom. I asked his mum and I asked him, but it was mostly his mum who told me about it, what was going on. And she said, this is a zero tolerance school. This is a boy who really needs to move. He really is, like, you could just see it when you saw him. He was full of energy. And the approach of the school was to clamp down on anything. So he was tapping his pen on the desk. Every time he tapped his pen on the desk, he would get his name written up on the board. He couldn't stop himself tapping his pen on the desk, and he was rocking his chair. He would get his name written up on the board. When he got his name written up on the board 3 times, then that would mean he was up to the next level of behavioural intervention. I can't remember quite what it was, but basically he was getting elevated every time. The consequences of this meant that the whole of the rest of the class saw him as a bad child, partly because they also had whole group discipline. So if the whole class were well behaved for a whole week, they would get something at the end. The whole class would get something at the end. So his class did not like him because he was the person who was constantly preventing them from getting this reward at the end. So they were horrible to him. They ostracized him. He started fighting with them in the playground. He started getting in trouble there. He started getting suspended, isolated. The whole thing was this cascade of difficulty for him. And I actually suggested to his mum, I said, I think maybe you should look at moving him to a different school that takes a different approach, because I can't see that this is ever going to sort of, this child isn't going to change. Doesn't sound like the school is going to change. You've basically got quite a child with quite strong needs, and you've got a very rigid environment, and the two are simply clashing like that. She did move him to another school, and I saw them again a few months later, and she said, this other school's amazing. What happened was he was tapping his pen on the desk, and the teacher got a bit of foam and wrapped it around the pencil. So now he can tap his phone on his pencil on the desk. He doesn't disturb anybody, and it's not a problem. And so this cascade isn't happening for him. And I think it's just such an example of how such a tiny thing, because of these feedback loops all the time, can make such a big difference to somebody. So that's just an illustration of that. So unfortunately, what can happen is that school can be a disabling environment for many children. if you think about it, there are so many things that are challenging just about that school environment. You've got quite restricted choices. You can't go and move around when you need to. Very few chances to change the environment to suit you. You're in large groups of people all day. There's no privacy at school. Even the toilet is not really private. That's really hard for lots of people. And I think in order for kids to cope with that, they kind of have to squash a lot of their feelings. There's noise all the time, there's smells. I don't know about the rest of you, but if I go into a British primary school, I'm immediately hit by the smell of school dinners, which is hugely evocative of my own primary school experience. There's age-based requirements, which some kids just aren't quite ready for. There's no space to escape, and there are rules about clothes and food. This group of children actually aren't in school uniform, so I'm thinking they must be in a different country. Yes, they're definitely in a different country because the writing on the board looks like it's in Chinese, but in England, they would typically all be wearing the same clothes. And there are very strict rules about food, which some children find very difficult as well, that you have to have particular things in your packed lunch. You're not allowed to have other things. Some children have to eat at school dinners. All of those things add up to making it really hard for some kids who have quite specific differences. And as I said with my example, the more rigid that environment, the more likely it is that some children won't be able to manage. And the only choice is between brain and blame. And this is where I feel so bad as a psychologist, because I feel like then we are drawn in to reinforce that environment, really, because instead of saying, hang on, this environment is really rigid, surely any human would resist this environment. And the kids who aren't, maybe we should be worried about them, because what are they doing putting up with this level of control? Instead, the kids who don't comply get sent to me, and then I master diagnose them. And this really, one of the things that really became clear to me when I was doing this was how difficult it is as a professional not to give that diagnosis. If you know that a child has been waiting for 2 years, you know that the parents and the child feel that this diagnosis, everything is hanging on it. This is the make or break moment of whether they're going to get help or not. And actually you think, this child doesn't fit these criteria, or they do kind of fit the criteria, but there are other things going on. So for example, I had a child who did meet the criteria for ADHD, absolutely, without question. But her history was full of trauma, just full of trauma. Nobody was asking about the trauma. She was living with her grandmother because her parents, I'm not even going to go into it, but it was horrible what had happened to her. We know that when somebody's traumatized, they find it very hard to sit still. They find it very hard to concentrate. We know all those things, but the symptoms, they're not specific enough. So, and we weren't looking at the trauma. Part of my job was not to assess the trauma, because I was there to say, does this child have ADHD? Does this child have autism? And yes, they fit the criteria for ADHD. But I thought, actually, you know what? This child is traumatized. And of course, the approach is different. If a child's traumatized, they should go and have therapy, which could help them with that, because there are actually things we can do about that. I told the grandmother this, and she was actually furious. Not because she disagreed that the child was traumatized, because she was desperate for help, because she had got these children because her daughter was no longer able to look after them, and this hadn't really been something she had chosen for herself. And she was dealing with a really difficult situation, and nobody was helping her. And it felt to her like that was me again saying, sorry, I won't help you. So it's very difficult. We get co-opted into the system. So this is thinking about these children, that we've created this education system, and then along comes the child who doesn't fit in. And what we do is we try and cut bits off them, or we try and put in little tweaks that would maybe just make things a little bit better. So, maybe if they can't sit still, we give them movement cushions, or we give them fiddle toys, and we give them all these kind of things. In fact, somebody was saying about mindfulness. I think mindfulness can be used a bit like this. It can be like, oh, so, you're really stressed and you're really not happy in this environment. I'm going to teach you some mindfulness techniques, which will keep you in this environment that you're not very happy in. So, but actually, what about if we started with thinking about how can we change the shape of education, rather than how can we change the child to make them fit into this education? Then we might be thinking about how could we change the shape of the whole, rather than how can we change things about the child. The best way, I think, to do this is to allow children to make choices. There's a lot of speak about personalized education, and often it's people from the outside trying to see what a child needs. I can't really understand why it isn't more efficient to actually look at what the child's drawn to, what the child needs in order to thrive, and to start there. Instead, what often happens is a kind of targeted process of assessing the child. We need to intervene here, we need to intervene here, we need to intervene here. It all can be very focused on deficit. So I think that self-directed education has this huge advantage that it allows us to start with strengths. It allows us to start with what can allow this to thrive. To what children want about their education, how they want to learn, we would be setting up something very, very different, particularly for younger children. I have not yet met a younger child who says they want to go and sit in a classroom, except if they've been told that this is going to be the most exciting thing they've ever experienced. And it's great that now they're 4 or 5 and they can go off to school and it's the start of this huge adventure. And of course, there is a lot of indoctrination that goes on along this. There are children's books all everywhere about how starting school is this amazing thing. And you see children so excited about going off, and then a few weeks in, you see the realization that this is every day now. They have to do it every day. And often at this stage, the 4 and 5-year-olds tell their parents, I've done it now, I don't need to do it again. And they haven't understood that this is going to be the next 11 or 12 years for them, that they'll be going to the same place and they'll be listening to what somebody else thinks they should be doing. Because I think the most important thing about personalising education really, and that I think if you listen to children, what they say is that they want to be able to choose. They want to be able to stop when they want to be able to choose what they do, and they want to be able to stop when they don't want to do something anymore. I'd like now just to take a little thought experiment for everybody here and just think about something that maybe you've been forced to do. It could be anything. It could be, we are made to do things all the time. We're made to take speed awareness workshops if we break the speed limit, or we're made to do things at work that we don't think we should be doing or that we don't like to be doing. How do you feel about it when you're made to do something? Just take a few moments to think and just focus on that feeling in your body. When I think about it, I get this sort of feeling in my chest, kind of like, How does it make you feel then about the person who made you do that thing? If it's someone at work who's saying, no, I don't mind what you think, this is what you've got to do. And then the last question, what happened when you were no longer forced to do something? Did you continue to do that thing out of choice? I might just stop sharing for a moment and ask people to put any thoughts they have about that in the chat. Just if anybody's did that experiment, how did it make you feel after you stopped being forced? People are talking about jail. Yeah. What are the actual feelings of this was something I was made to do? If anyone wants to say, you can wave at me, actually say something. I mean, it's something I noticed for myself quite early on, that even things that I really enjoyed, when I was made to do them, suddenly became something that I didn't want to do. Yes, someone said piano lessons. I had piano lessons. I used to love reading as a child. I read so much that I would carry 2 books around with me everywhere, one that I was reading and one in case I finished the one that I was reading, so I could start another one straight away. And, I was whizzing through those books, including quite complicated books, except if I was made to read a book for school. The moment that I was made to read a book for school, particularly when I was told you need to read 150 pages, for example, it was weird. I remember sitting there going, why can't I just relax and enjoy reading this book like I would normally enjoy reading a book? I can't disconnect from this fact that I've been told I've got to read 150 pages. It's all my focus is on the fact I'm being made to do it. And so I don't want to. I think that's a really basic human thing, that we don't want to do things when we're forced to do them. And yet we pathologize it. We pathologize it in children. We say if they don't do the things we want them to do, there's something wrong with them, rather than something wrong with what we're doing. I'm going to go back now, I hope, to my screen. Where was I? Here. Yep, there we are. So I'm going to talk a bit now about how when we do that to children, when we try and force them into a predetermined mold, it means that all of their energies, if they are a bit different and they don't easily fit into that mold, all of their energies go onto that. So they can't really use their energies to work out how they themselves might best live and learn, because they're too focused on how do I survive? How do I survive in this environment, which feels wrong to me, which feels hostile to me, and that I'm so aware of. I think one way of thinking about these children is that they're so much more sensitive to things that are there in the environment, that other children that are there for everybody. It's simply that for them, it's more salient. They can't stop thinking about it because it's for them, it's like an attack on who they are. But when we let them choose, they can create individualized learning environments for themselves. So what happens if we take a self-directed approach and we allow children to choose? What happens which is different to school? Well, they learn about things that are interesting to them at the time they're interested. They develop in different times and they follow different trajectories, which is something I'm going to talk about a bit more later. They develop a sense of themselves as people who can make changes in the world. I think this is particularly important for children who are a bit different. Sometimes there's a kind of feeling that if somebody maybe has difficulties in learning, then we need to do more earlier. They need to have formal education earlier. They need to be controlled effectively earlier to try and make them into something different. I think that's a really sad thing to do to somebody, because actually it's so important to develop a sense of who you are and who you want to be in the world. And the earlier we go in there and say, you need to be doing this differently, the more we disrupt that. Real learning is really messy, just like life. The challenge is, I think, for us as adults to allow our children to take this, is that to let go of our own assumptions. And there are particular ones that come with neurodiversity. There's the assumptions that most adults have about learning, which is that if we don't make them, we'll never do it, which I think is weird, because as we've just done, when you think about how you feel yourself when you're forced, it doesn't make you more likely to do something. But yet with children, it's like we think something different. We think that making them is the only way. We think that we have to push them through development. We think if they don't force them when they'll be 15, they'll still be sitting playing in the sand and the mud. And what will we do then? It will be disaster. There are some beliefs like autistic kids need structure, which is used often to impose a lot of control. They think if we don't intervene early, things will be worse when they're older. And also people often say they aren't capable of making choices or problem solving. This is something that often parents whose children have been diagnosed with ADHD tell me. They're not capable of doing these things. So how can I let them choose these things? Isn't that neglect? To which my answer is, we learn to do these things through doing them. All of these things, even if you're not very good at making decisions or problem solving, you will not get better at it by not being allowed to do it. Neurodevelopment goes alongside environment. The two interact. The experiences you have form your learning. They form your brain. Your brain is neuroplastic. It changes it with your environment. The kids who have difficulty with these things, I think, need more chances to do it. If you're someone who has a problem with paying attention is something different, I won't come to that, but problem solving, you need to get chances to solve lots of problems, ideally during childhood, because what better time to make mistakes, to have difficulties, because you've got, hopefully for most kids, you've got a safety net underneath you. Things cannot go too badly wrong in childhood because you've got adults around to mop it up, to help you out. Instead, what we do is we prevent children from making meaningful decisions until they become teenagers and young adults, at which point the consequences become much more serious. And also it's much harder for adults to step in and help out. So when people say, aren't you worried your children will make poor decisions? I'm like, I'd far rather they make any kind of poor decision, in quotes, when they're 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 than when they're 20, 21, 22, because they haven't had any practice of doing this before. So I'd like, again, to just think, maybe yourselves, just think quickly about what your fears about learning. You may all be going to say, oh, I don't have any fears. I've been unschooling for years. I'm completely up with it. I don't know. My kids are now 13 and 10. We've been unschooling or self-directed learning since the beginning, but certainly since my son was 4. I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, what if I actually have got it all wrong and they should have been at school all along? What if they're missing out on all sorts of things? And I think it's important to allow ourselves to have those thoughts and then just to say, well, those are my thoughts and feelings, because I don't think we should have to squash those feelings as well. What we don't want to do is act them upon our children. So what often happens is people get really scared about what's going to happen with their kids, and the reaction is control. So they think, oh my goodness, what if they never want to learn maths? Right, better get out that maths curriculum and sit them down every day and let's do some maths. Because, and that in that way, the parent feels a bit more relaxed, because the parent feels like I'm doing something, but the child feels the pressure. And unfortunately, pressure is counterproductive. And we particularly know that with kids who are a bit different. I'm going to just talk now about how learning changes through childhood, because it is something that people often say, particularly if they've got younger children. They say, well, what happens next? We can visualize self-direction for younger children, because bizarrely, our school system works by giving the youngest children the most autonomy, the most choices. So a well-run nursery classroom or reception, children are making choices all the time. The choices are limited by what the adults have set up, but the choices are there, and they're generally choices of things that children find rewarding and like doing. So, they can choose to go and play with the Play-Doh, they can choose to construct something. Often they might be able to choose to go outside when they want to, they can choose to play alone, they can choose to play with friends. There are a lot of choices in your average early years classroom. Then what we do as children get more capable is we remove those choices. So in those early years, children are learning through play largely, and they're in the kind of discovery phase of learning. They learn a wide range of skills because that's what's meaningful to them. They don't set out to learn skills deliberately in this stage, most children. So they don't set out saying, right, I need to learn to talk, better get on with that, let's do some practice. They want to communicate, so they learn to talk. They don't set out to think, right, I really want to improve with my block building skills, for example, or my Lego. They love doing it, so they do it, and they get better at some things because of that. They're also learning really important skills about how to manage themselves in the world. Self-regulation, which I may be using slightly differently to James, I'm not sure. Problem solving, setting goals, controlling impulses, all of those things they're developing through those early years. And this is kind of the discovery phase of learning. When we see self-directed children, we see that children can learn an awful lot more in this phase than teachers and schooling would assume. For example, it's not at all uncommon for self-directed children to learn how to read and write in the discovery phase. It's not uncommon for them to learn quite a lot of maths. It's not uncommon for them to learn an awful lot of knowledge about things that they are interested in. So, and what I think we see with unschooled and self-directed kids is that this discovery phase can go on for a lot longer than it does in school. Because what happens in school is you go in quite quickly, it's all about let's channel you into phonics, let's channel you into maths, let's get you as quickly as we can really sitting in a desk and concentrating, facing forwards, listening to the teacher. When that doesn't happen, then what we see is something different, because value this time. And unfortunately, that's particularly best kids, because if a child is identified early on as having autism, in particular autism, but other diagnoses as well, there's often a push to get them into nursery earlier, to get everything started earlier, to get them into therapies earlier, to intervene earlier. And what intervention usually means is less free play, fewer choices, and more adult control, which I think is really sad, basically, because what we're doing is we're taking away those opportunities from children in the name of trying to catch them up, is often what's used. That means that very quickly, for parents and for children, all the focus can be on their perceived deficits and how they should be changing it. So these are just a few of the things that people are told that their children aren't doing at the right stage. Eye contact is the classic one. Sitting still, reading and writing, making friends, keeping quiet, following instructions, concentrating, and emotional regulation. And actually, when I left off here was imaginative play. Children often, if at 2 or 3 they're not doing imaginative play, then that is one of the diagnostic criteria for autism, and they can be that will be again something that's a perceived deficit. I think it's really damaging to focus parents so early on in what they think their child can't do. because it changes your whole way of thinking about your child. You know, parents, when they first have their child, children are amazing. They're full of wonder. They're learning all these things. They're doing all these things. And then if you go through a process when that child's very young, which says they can't do this like other children, they're not doing this as well as other children, they're not doing this as well as other children, that is kind of taken away from you. That wonder of, wow, this amazing child who's doing all this incredible stuff. And I wish there was a way that we could acknowledge difference and acknowledge that some children do have difficulties in developing skills that they're going to need without labeling them as deficient. So what we do with self-directed education is we can flip that around, and instead we can focus on strengths. And there's a lot of research that shows that when people focus on their strengths, their weaknesses improve as well. But when they just focus on their weaknesses, their strengths don't improve. So the questions we might be asking ourselves in this kind of early stage of learning is, where does this child really blossom? What do they love to do? How can I help them do more of that? What makes them really come alive? And what happens if I listen to them? Because what happens is that we have this discovery phase of learning, and the developmental psychologists like Alison Gopnik say that they think this starts to sort of move on, the children start to move on from this around the age of 7. From looking at the self-directed kids around me, I think that's partly because of schooling. I think schooling pushes children out of this discovery phase of learning, because what I see is that actually for self-directed kids, it starts to happen more around the age of 9 or 10. They start to relate to the world a bit differently. They start to be more intentional about things. They start to plan their goals. They start to look ahead. They start to think, what would I like to learn here? That doesn't mean they're going to suddenly make the choices that an adult would make for them. And it's called the mastery learning stage. Now, the key thing about this is that self-directed learning is not like school, and it's not linear. So for parents of kids who are a bit different, this can really mean holding your nerve, because kids follow these developmental trajectories. Here, I've got this nice slide here, that are so very different to this nice purple arrow, which is what school really likes to see. School wants to see nice linear progress over time. You know, parents are asked to fill in questionnaires, not parents, teachers, they're asked to fill in stuff, continuously saying, you know, this child is making progress. What we see with self-directed kids is it just doesn't work like that. A child might appear to be making no progress at all with reading, for example, and then suddenly, over the course of about 2 weeks, they pick up books, start reading, and they're off. Children might make a very patchy progress. It might seem like, wow, suddenly they're really good at reading. Next day, gosh, I really don't think they can read at all. And it's just going round and round and round. And that's fine. That's how everybody learns. Actually, I think if you think of it outside school, there's no real reason why this progression should be linear. And Harriet Patterson's research on reading, I think, is really useful here. She looked at 400 home-educated children, and she found enormously diverse routes into reading. What she found, and I think this is the thing that really excites me about her research, is she found that once a child was out of school, just because they weren't reading at the age of 6, 7, 8, or 9, or even 10, didn't mean that they weren't going to learn to read, and nor did it mean that their learning would be held back due to the lack of reading. This is very different to what happens in school. If at school you're not reading by the time you're 6, people are worried. If you're 7, 8, 9, 10, they're really worried. You're going to be probably sent to get diagnosed with something. There's going to be the assumption you're going to have missed out on a lot, and you're going to be struggling every day in school, because school uses reading to access. Reading and writing is the way that children access most of their learning. And this means that kids who learn to read late at school sort of carry a legacy with them of all that time they weren't able to read and they weren't able to participate, but also all that time when they felt bad about themselves because they couldn't read, and they felt ashamed because they couldn't read. Outside school, that doesn't have to happen. And so you see that when children do learn to read, they can take off. They can come in at the level that they are at. And it doesn't have to be a matter of shame. So when children choose what they do, we really see these different trajectories, just like I was saying, and particularly with neurodiverse children. I think I really want to do some research into this at some point, because what I see in the kids around me is that children start to do many of the things which they don't do in early childhood much later and carry it on for longer. So imaginative play is the thing I've really noticed. And that's probably because I have a PhD in autism. I was kind of tuned into imaginative play. You know, it's quite a central thing in developmental psychology that imaginative play is really important. Children should be doing imaginative play from about, 18 months really. And that sort of 18 months to like 3 or 4 is like peak time for imaginative play. Lots of autistic children don't do that. And that's one of the reasons they might get diagnosed at that stage. Then they're playing in different ways. They might be spinning things, they might be rocking on things, they might be really interested in how things work. They're often interested in different things. What I noticed in the autistic kids that I see around me who didn't do that imaginative play is that they often started playing imaginatively much later. So maybe at 5, 6, or 7, they started playing imaginatively. And that they did it in different ways. Often they might start imaginative play in something like Minecraft, for example, which is the most amazing sandbox game to do kind of things like that. You can play role play, you can make your own things, you can play imaginatively in Minecraft. Of course, what was happening though, is that by the point that these children were starting imaginative play, if they were in school, the focus had moved on from imaginative play. It was no longer the focus or people don't think it's important in the same way when children become older. So I'm really interested in this idea that self-directed kids get this extra time when they have this drive towards imaginative play. They can immerse themselves in imaginative play, just as lots of really young children get the chance to do, because when you're 2 or 3, that's fine. Everybody's fine with being immersed in imaginative play. Then we're not so fine as a society with kids being immersed in imaginative play when they're 7, 8, or 9. And particularly, we're not up for them being immersed in imaginative video play. We want that imaginative play to fit a certain mold. We want little tea parties, and that kind of teddy bears, that kind of thing. And I think this stage is really important for some of these kids. This is where they're getting the chance to develop a lot of these skills. We know from seeing kids that they can learn fine for years before they start to read and write, because if they're outside school, they can learn through audio books, they can learn through videos, they can learn through conversations. Everything doesn't have to be channeled through a book. They can start to socialize in their own way and in their own time. And I think that's another really important thing for neurodiverse kids, that there isn't this pressure to have friends when they're 3 or 4. If they're not inclined in that way, fine. And often what will happen is later on, they'll start to develop their own relationships, again, often through video games, and they'll start to socialize in their own way. If all the other things I talked about, those layers of shame and anxiety at not doing these things earlier, haven't interfered with that process. We also see that they can dive really deep into the things that fascinate them. So they have a special interest in something, they can just go for it. They can learn all the time about that because they're not being required to do all of these different lessons every day. And I think this combination means that neurodiverse kids are able to develop a sense of how they learn best, rather than having to put all their energies into fitting into the system that doesn't work for them. And I think that means that self-directed education is particularly well suited for children who need something different. And if we avoid this pressure to fit in, we can avoid the shame and anxiety, which often goes alongside that. And when we do that, we just don't know what children can achieve. We just don't know what they're going to do. And not learning something at one stage doesn't mean they might not learn it later. And I think that's a real difference in mindset, that the sort of traditional approach will be, oh, they're not doing this now, probably that's going to be it now. They won't be social, or they won't do imaginative play, or they won't learn to read even. But actually what we see from self-directed kids is they do it later in their own time. So my message would really be, if the standard doesn't fit you, make something new, do it in your own way. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit more, because often at this stage, people say to me, well, that's all right for you, providing your children with things to do, but my child is different. My child won't do anything. There are lots of responses to this question, but I'm just going to talk a little bit. Oh, I hope I am, if my slides can go on. Let's have a look. There we are. I'm just going to talk about one thing, because neurodiverse kids in particular can have very sensitive nervous systems. They can be very quickly put into a state of fight or flight. Fight, flight, or fright. Is that it? So you know what I mean? The survival response. They react with very high stress or anxiety to things which other people don't necessarily find stressful. And this can be really mystifying for parents. And of course, one of the things that can do this to them is school. Our brains have this little bit in the middle called the amygdala. And the amygdala is like our alarm system. It is the bit that tells us when we're in danger. It's like a bit like a smoke alarm, basically. It goes off and says, danger, 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 get out of here. When we have lots of traumatic things happen to us, our amygdala becomes sensitized to those things. It starts to trigger off more easily, more quickly. So for example, if you've got a child who's had a really bad time in school, who's been traumatized by the control that went on in school, perhaps nothing that somebody else thought objectively thinks is traumatic, but for that child it was experienced as traumatic, their amygdala can be highly sensitized and it can be triggered on a, doesn't matter what, it can be triggered all the time by things in the environment which might match that traumatizing environment. So that, say, school. So for example, it could be a group of other kids, or it could be a smell, or it could be a type of building. All of those things can trigger the amygdala, sending the child into fight or flight, which will often look like really resistant behavior. There are different ways it can express itself. It can be, fighting, literally fighting. It can be running away, or it can be freezing. So what we need to think about is keeping children in the window of tolerance, because that is where they are able to learn. And lots of children, when they're at school, they're not in that window of tolerance. And then if they come out of school, they're still not in that window of tolerance because they've basically been in escalation or hyperarousal all the time. So what I often tell parents is that you need to think about a pyramid of self-directed education. You cannot go in at the top with learning, in quotes, in the way that school tries to do. You have to start with safety, emotional security, and physical well-being. And for kids who struggle with that, for kids who don't really feel safe, that can be a lot of work. And that can be the main bit of what you're doing as a parent, or the main bit of what you're doing as a self-directed setting. You're trying to make a safe environment in which people feel safe. Only when that happens are they able then to start to gradually look outside, gradually think, oh, that might be interesting. Because at this point, when you're at the bottom of the pyramid, your priority is keep myself safe. And you're going to avoid anything that makes you feel any anxiety at all, because that will make you feel unsafe. It's better just to stay where you are. It feels safer. So what we want to do gradually over time is to help them move up to the top where they're able to engage and to explore. And the way to start that is by joining them exactly where they are, rather than where you'd like them to be. And I remember I was talking at the beginning about how there's this as they are now, and to join them with where they are. If they like spinning things, spin things with them. If they like building things, build things with them. If they like watching YouTube videos, watch YouTube videos with them. And he would construct wooden models of locks, and we bring them and we would work with them together. And he also, in his spare time, made fireworks. So, and again, that's where I started. I joined him in seeing his interest, watching what he did. He would bring me videos of his fireworks that he'd made, and we'd watch them together. So we're wanting to rebuild those relationships and co-regulation. Co-regulation is about when between the adult and the child, you regulate emotions. You need that relationship that's built on trust and support, getting alongside the child rather than pulling them towards something, and prioritizing connection and mutual respect. Unfortunately, many parents are amazing at this, but I do think the whole system which says your child needs to be doing these different things makes that more difficult. It makes it more difficult to say, I'm going to stick with this child just as they are right now, and I'm going to help them be the best person they can be right now, and what they do, live the best life they can live right now, rather than try all the time and fix them. Oops. So we need to find an environment where they feel safe. There's lots of different ways to do that. And then another thing which I think is really important to know is that when we have self-directed kids and when they make choices, the differences don't go away. Sometimes people talk in this whole world of self-directed education say these differences are created by school. If a child's out of school, they'll go away, there won't be a problem anymore. I don't think that's the case. I think humans are very different. And I think that's the whole neurodiversity paradigm. Humans are different and highly variable. And some people have individual temperamental differences, personality differences, whatever it is that makes it more difficult for them to exist in the world. And some people have differences that are more likely to result in them being disabled or distressed in the world. And when we have children who are out of school, actually those differences can become both more obvious and less of an issue at the same time. So just to give an example, when children are young, lots of them do things like jump up and down when they're excited, or flap their hands when they're excited, or make noises when they're excited. When they go to school, quite quickly, they learn that those things aren't acceptable. The other children tell them, or the teachers tell them, because everyone's meant to be being quiet. And those children who can suppress that behaviour do suppress that behaviour. Some of the children can't suppress that behaviour. And those are the children who tend to get sent to me, and because they are visibly different, they're visibly doing something different. When you've got self-directed kids, that doesn't happen. There's never a time when people say, stop doing that, don't do that. And so actually children continue with these behaviours for much longer. And so if you look at a group of self-directed old children and young and teenagers, I think you see much more diverse behaviour than you would see in a schooled group. And you'd see lots more difference because they haven't been made to think that their differences are a problem. Because I really think that its core, neurodiversity means recognising and valuing difference. And I think that self-directed education provides a chance for children and young people to do this and to learn in whatever way works best for them. This doesn't mean that there's one way of learning. Sometimes people take self-directed education to mean no structure, free play, nothing else, no adult involvement. It doesn't mean that at all. It means whatever works best for the child. And it means observing and working with the child to work out what's best for them. It might involve structure. Some children prefer structure. It might involve informal learning. It might involve taking classes if that's what they want to do. It would involve reading books, watching videos, playing games, conversations. It can involve a whole range of things. The adults provide the opportunities and the sense of safety and the connection, but each child needs to be able to say no, and they need to be able to choose. Because neurodiversity is part of all of us. And when we allow our children to be autonomous, we can just see how amazing that is. It's really a strength, not a weakness. When we have a group of people thinking in very different ways, we can achieve things that we can't achieve if everybody's thinking in the same mindset. And we actually don't need to try and make our children fit this mold. So if you're just thinking about how might I actually start a different approach with my child or with a child I know, then I'd say start where the child is and join them there. Also start with yourself and challenge your assumptions about what that child might need. Observe the child and watch what makes them come alive, and just do more of that. You'll see the learning everywhere. Read lots of books for yourself about things, but don't insist on your child doing the same. And try and find a community of people who can support you in your choices and who will accept you and your child for exactly who you are. If you have a young child, I think it's particularly important to be able to see people with older children, so you can see the trajectory. You can see that things do change over time. And part of it, I think, is embracing your own differences and those of the people around you. Many parents say, that when their child got a diagnosis, it was like a eye-opening moment for themselves, because they realized that actually they share many of the characteristics with their child. And yet what happened to them was that they had to squash all that down. I think that's extraordinarily common, because I actually think that a lot of what we learn at school is that we have to squash parts of ourselves. We have to keep ourselves into that little desk space. There isn't really space for us to be truly who we are. So this is just a cycle that I sometimes thinking about what you can do: observe a child, reduce the pressure, get alongside them, and then join them in. Really, it's absolutely crucial that children can say no to things. That's the whole point, that they are the person who remains in control of their learning. And if we take that away from them because we think we've planned this amazing thing which they're going to love, we've taken away something really important by taking away that choice. And that I talk in other talks, I talk about motivation and internal motivation, why I think that's so important. This is what it is. Children need to have that autonomy over what they do. But I think this is particularly important for children who are neurodiverse. So I'm going to come off in a moment because I think change starts right here. And I'm going to stop sharing in a moment so that we can all just discuss it a bit. But just to finish, this is my book, which is called How. Because that's where I post most of my thoughts and my writing. And now I'm going to stop. I'm going to come back to the room and I'm going to see your questions. Thank you. Okay. If anybody would like to unmute themselves, that would be great. So somebody has said, that's a great question. Somebody said, loves the ideals of self-directed. Safe. And I would say, join with them in the YouTube, sit beside them, watch what they're doing, seek out new things for them to watch, offer them. They may not want to watch them, that's fine. Give them the chance. What I did, my kids, they have had their YouTube phases, but they've also had their just iPad phases when they've just been on the iPad. A big moment of change for me was when I embraced the iPad as a way of learning, as opposed to something I needed to pull away from them. So what I did was I sought out as the best, most interesting apps I could find. And they weren't learning to read apps or, let's do maths apps. They were what I thought would be the most interesting apps. I looked at what my children loved. Mostly I Google searched, apps for people that like this one, or best apps for 9-year-olds. And I looked them on and I would load them up on the children's iPad. So they would be there, because at a particular stage in my children's lives, they did not want any suggestions from me at all. Any suggestion, I used to say, if I suggest something, I immediately pollute the idea, to the extent that I suggested Minecraft to my children when they were quite young, and they refused to have anything to do with it until another child introduced Minecraft to them. And now they've probably played Minecraft. I mean, Minecraft's amazing. We have played it non-stop for years and years and years, but I couldn't introduce it. It had to be introduced some other way. So so yeah, I would still say join them, and join them where they are. Look at what they're getting out of it. Then don't rubbish their choices, because there'll be a reason why they're choosing that. You're losing me for seconds. Oh dear, sorry. Oh dear, someone said they had the same thing with Minecraft. Yeah. I joke that with my children, the sort of mantra of their early childhood was me saying, I've got this great idea, and my son would say, Mummy, I've got a much better idea. And basically we always did his ideas, because his ideas were what he wanted to do. But yes, it's absolutely. And someone said, yes, fight or freeze is the form response. Yes, that's true. I haven't gone into that, but there are other responses that come as a response to trauma. Penny, you have a quick question.
Yeah, a quick question. It was too long to write it. So okay. Thank you, Naomi. That was so interesting. And really, I loved your talk yesterday, and it linked well with James's earlier. In terms of the kind of, I know that lots of people here have different experiences of home education and self-directed learning and self-managed learning and so on. But in terms of the state system, so say, for instance, the English education system, the average number of children in a class is approximately 30. So how would you apply the notion of agency and self-directed inquiry in a class that usually only has one teacher, sometimes a teaching assistant? Because it's something that, I'm very committed to.
So, I mean, I'm not a teacher, so I wouldn't want to tell people how to manage a classroom. Derry might be, in fact, Derry is the right person to answer this question, I believe, because he has done this in a class, he's a secondary school teacher and he's done it. Do you want to answer the question, Derry?
Well, yes, and I had more than 30. It was a secondary modern school, and I had 35 kids who just failed the 11 plus, but fortunately I had a big classroom. And because of integrated humanities, now scrapped by Mr. Gove, it was possible to work with those kids for about 60% of curriculum time, which meant it was perfectly possible to shove the desks to one side, create a circle, start a discussion. Kids would learn to chair meetings, etc., and then create the curriculum and introduce self-directed education into the mainstream setting. I had the support of the head, and that was very important. There were 7 teachers doing this across the year group. It was a big school. I thought I'd get fired, but in the second year I got put in charge of all 7 classes with the ability to appoint some of the teachers, and we formed a very strong group in the school of people who really believed in this, working in this way. And the lovely thing was, because these kids had failed the 11 plus, once the parents saw them rediscovering the joy of learning and looking forward to going to school, we were unstoppable, because there's nothing a head teacher likes more than nice noises from parents. But by God, we met some opposition in the heads of the traditional departments who said we were crazy. But the lovely thing is, I'm still in touch with some of those kids from my first class who are now 60 and coming up to retirement. And one of them in particular became eventually the head teacher of a primary school, which he ran in a democratic way, having remembered what it was like from 11 to 13 being in a democratic class. It's what my book's all about. And if you buy it, by the way, any proceeds while it's sold during the conference are going to the Summerhill Festival. I don't know if that even begins to answer your question, Penny, but do come to my workshop this evening or on Sunday.
And yeah, and Derry's book does outline quite clearly how he does it. Actually, it's worth reading. But the other things I would say, just from kind of psychology perspective, that teachers can do is, I think if you can have tasks that children do that aren't marked by a teacher, that the children evaluate themselves, and where there is some degree of choice, I think you're starting to bring some autonomy in there. So there's a problem. We know from all the psychology studies that the minute you put a grade at the end of something and you tell kids, you know, you've got to do well in this, they're going to go for the easiest option. Makes complete sense. We all do this. I did it in exams. You look at them, you think, this is the easy one, I'll write this one. If you want children to challenge themselves and to learn, then you need to remove that grading option in the end. So that would be what I would be suggesting to teachers as a quick thing. If you can do it, give them a few choices. So you're going to write a story, give a few options that they can choose from, and you're going to be the one who evaluates whether you think your story was good or not. And you can tell us about it, and maybe you can think about what might you want to improve next time and what you might do, you know. So just give them back some of that ownership.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Alfred Kern's work, Punishment by Reward.
Absolutely.
Just quickly, and I'll just put this in and then I'll shut up. But so thank you, both of you, for those answers. I think my frustration is, you know, I'm on your page, I'm completely committed, and our project School Without Walls is very much around self-directed inquiries. Whereas my frustration is in the formal teaching scenario, whether it's initial teacher education or in continuing professional development for teachers. There's a lot of fear around giving young people that agency and control and freedom, which I'm totally committed to. I was just trying to find a way of breaking the system, to be honest.
I think it's so sad that we can imagine what agency looks like for 5 and 4-year-olds, and yet we can't. You know, so many teachers I talk to who are teaching in secondary say, well, I couldn't do that with my 14-year-olds, you know, it'd be mayhem. They're like, but you know, I'll bet you when those 14-year-olds were 3 and 4, they were probably in a nursery class where they were more autonomous than they are now. So what's happened in this system? Why have we not developed this autonomy to the point that now that they're more mature, surely they should be able to manage more of it. But instead, what we've done is limit their options, control them more and more. And if you control humans, you get resistance. Yes, Derry.
Well, I think it's got harder since Gove. It has got harder. The whole thing has become more prescriptive, more punitive. It's much harder, but I think there's always something you can do. You can always discuss, you can always get in a circle, you can always make some decisions in the class. But if you leave it till 14, 15, Naomi, there's no doubt that it gets harder, because
absolutely.
these kids have got bigger and they've learned how to fight back in some cases.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult. You need to start at a much younger age, like perhaps 1.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that is the problem. People will say, how do we start with our 14-year-olds? Well, unfortunately, they've had 10 years of being told that what they think doesn't matter. And it's going to take a long time for them to believe something different. And we see that with kids who come out of school. The older you are, the longer it takes for you to kind of reconnect with that sense of inner agency and curiosity, because those years matter. Those years of being told we don't mind what you do, do what you're told. It has a huge impact. Someone just asked, what about praising? And someone asked, what about too much autonomy? I'll just answer those and then I'll come to you, Faye. I see you were waving. What about praising? Well, I would recommend Alfie Kern's book, Punished by Rewards, Bruno. He goes in a lot to praising and the flip side of praising. Personally, I wouldn't be using, praising is another way of manipulation. I haven't talked about motivation in this talk, but I talked about it in my talk yesterday, and it's a lot of it, I've got that in my book. When we externalize the motivation from somebody, we take the control away from them. And we can do that through praise, we can do that through punishments, all of those things shift the emphasis from what the child's doing, and I'm doing it because I really like it, to I'm doing this now to please an adult or to avoid punishment. And we know that's detrimental to their learning because the focus has shifted from the learning. It's just like the grades. You start giving grades at the end. Now the focus is on how do I get a good grade, as opposed to what am I really interested in? And I have an example I talk about in my book about this, where GCSEs, I chose music GCSE because I knew I would get an A in it. I knew I would learn nothing because I didn't like the teacher. It was boring. I already had I was a grade 8 on the flute. I knew the music theory. I knew I could walk through it and get an A at the end. I would have much rather done art, which was in the same time slot, but I was pretty sure I'd only get a B or maybe a C for art because I wasn't very artistic. And therefore at 14, I cut off that option for myself and I went with music. I got my A in music. Why? What was the point of it? It was all because of the A, basically. I put up with 2 years of music because of the A. And I wish that we didn't do that to children so early. I wish that it's funny, my son's 13 and he's sort of saying, I'd like to do GCSE and this, GCSE and this. And I'm kind of like, can't we just have learning for quite a lot longer and not worry about whether you're going to do a GCSE or not? Because, it's so much more important to be able to focus on what am I interested in and what am I learning than am I going to get my A. And I mean, I'm not saying that GCSEs aren't important. I think they can be important, but I think we make the education system about grading way too early, and it's not a good thing. Somebody says, is there such thing as too much autonomy? Diversity is expressed to the extent that it becomes chaotic and hard for kids to join anything they don't want to. How does this reconcile with the other holy grail of resilience? Oh, interesting. D, I don't know who you are. You're just a D. Is it possible for you to explain a bit more about what you mean? Are you talking about self-directed learning settings being chaotic or home?
Hi, it's me, D.
Hi.
And Daryl. I'm not even, it's a very, very broad question and it's a bit rambling. I don't have it associated with schools specifically. I think it's something to tie in this idea that when I release and let go of that control enough that the kids really do get to decide and have a sense of autonomy, is there a point where if they choose not to do anything of some of the things that they, that we do need them to do sometimes as parents or whatever, how does that tie in with this idea that some things that if you stick with them, there's resilience that can come out of that, and that they will gain some sort of self-confidence or whatever that comes from sticking with something even though they didn't want to do it and getting the other side of it.
So I think there's a profound difference between sticking at something because somebody makes you do it and sticking at something because it's a goal that you want for yourself. And I think that's when I was talking about discovery and mastery learning, I think that's a shift that happens developmentally for kids. And we often think it's such a common thing for parents to say, don't I have to make them continue this, or they're never going to learn to stick at things. It isn't, this is not what I see. I see that, yes, younger children, it's really hard to make them stick at things. They don't usually want to do it. They, they're interested for a bit and they're off and that's it. They get to about 12 or 13 and their brains mature. So that's what's going on. Neurologically, there are massive changes going on in adolescence, and they become able to think about the future, to set goals, and they become able to do things even if they don't enjoy them because of their goal, but they're doing it for their own goal. And I don't think one develops resilience by being forced to do something for a long time. I think that's a myth, because it doesn't seem like to be resilient to me. It's compliance, isn't it? It's not, well, there's the resilience there. The resilience would be in, right, I really want to learn how to do this, for example. I would say my son, for example, when I noticed this sort of change in both my kids when they got to about 9, and they both learned to ride their bicycles around that time. And so my son, he's not very coordinated. I would say in a diagnostic world, he would absolutely get a diagnosis of dyspraxia. He just finds it really difficult to coordinate himself. Anyway, and I actually thought he might never learn to ride a bicycle because of this. Every time we got on a bicycle, he basically fell off it. He got up one day when he was 9. He's like, right, I'm going to learn how to ride this bicycle. He put on long sleeves, long trousers. He got on that bicycle and he fell off 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 for about 3 days straight. And he'd come in with wounds and I'd patch him up and he'd go off and he'd fall off again. And then he started to learn how to ride his bicycle. Now, he didn't love doing all the falling off bit. In fact, he really didn't like it. He doesn't like being injured. He doesn't like falling off. But he was like, I am going to learn how to do this. And he set to it and he did it. That's what I think resilience is. If I had forced him onto that bicycle all day for 3 days, I don't think that would be resilience. Do you? I think.
Yeah, no, you're dead right. But I think it's interesting as well, because you draw this. It's something you said earlier about, what was the term that you used? Like biding your time, like holding off, believing that, okay, maybe it's not now, it'll come later. With reading, I think you were talking about it, that,
yeah,
wow, he's not doing it by 6 or 7, and it's not interesting.
Yeah.
How do you contain that sense of, no, I need to help with that because it's going to be important, or it's, we have to stick with this somehow, and letting go of that and believing that they will get to it, as you said, at 12 or something, when it becomes, there's a shift that creates that.
Yeah, it's hard.
Themselves.
It's hard, I agree. And society tells you that won't happen and that you have to make that happen. And it can feel really tough to hold that space. And that's why I think it's important to read, to find other people with older kids so you can see that shift and to read stuff. I mean, my son is now 13 and he is so applied and focused and he would have never stuck with anything when he was younger. And people did say to me all the time, how's he going to learn to do things he doesn't want to do? Because I didn't make him do things. And I mean, he's the one who wouldn't play Minecraft. It wasn't that I just couldn't make him do things. I couldn't get him to do anything. He was the child who would be like, no, I've got a better idea, mummy. And that was his childhood. Now he gets up every morning and he practices the piano for an hour because he wants to learn how to play the piano. There is an enormous shift that happens if you can, and also I think for me, because my son was so sensitive to control, I just think it was an enormous gift for me, because it made me very aware of how damaging control and pressure actually is on learning and motivation. And so I think if you can hold on to that belief, there's always a flip side to this. You make the child do the maths, for example, but what have you done to your relationship with them? And what have you done to their relationship with maths? Actually, you've made it something they were made to do rather than something they wanted to do. I just wanted to, Derry, I wanted to let Faye raise her hand. I wanted to let her have a question before.
Thank you.
So I'm actually diagnosed with autism and I have ADHD as well. And dyspraxia. I got this really long list as a child.
Yeah.
And I was really quickly labelled as high functioning, and these functioning labels that come along with autism. And I work with children with autism in mainstream schools. And I've worked 3 years with them. And a lot of people say I have a different outlook on schools, and I don't see function. Often I say I don't think functioning labels help. I think they're box children into these boxes. And I was wondering, what's your opinion of functioning labels, and do you think they can ever be? Because some people have been so against me and said functioning labels are helpful. They tell me where that child's at. They let me get a picture of that child. And I think, I don't know, I wanted to hear your opinion, whether you think where it comes into self-directed learning and where you can put those functioning labels.
So I think you always have to think about the interaction between the child and the environment, always. So the problem with a blanket functioning label is that it assumes that this child will be the same in every environment, and they're not. So a child might be really high functioning in quotes at home and really not at all high functioning in another environment. And I think that kind of stops that from being the case. I do think there's a group of children who are really learning disabled and who's need an extraordinarily high level of support. And we do need a way to recognize that they need more. Do you know what I mean? That we need the children who, may never learn to toilet themselves, or may never learn to feed themselves, or have a really, really high level of need. And we do need to be able to talk about that, because there are some children for whom, we just need to be able to say that there are some children for whom life is, who if we get the environment right, life will be easier and they will be able to learn more. And there are some kids where their disabilities are at the level that we need to have a different outlook, I would say.
Do you feel like, I know there's a big thing about inclusive education massively in schools at the minute, mainstream schools, and whether specialist schools are the right thing. And when you're talking about those children with those learning disabilities and not being able to toilet and not being able to feed, you feel like this, I know it's a really big question, there's not always a right answer, but should we be using that inclusive education for everyone, and that self-directed learning can work for everyone? Or should we have those specialist schools that have that rigid structure, and that that child needs to learn how to put their coat on, and those really target setting led learning? Do you still think that applies to some children with learning disabilities?
That's a very big question. I mean, I think my general stance would be that we need diversity of educational choices, full stop. So I don't really buy into the idea we should have one inclusive place that fits everybody. I would much rather it was a kind of people were going into it. So I would love it if people could get to school age and it would be okay. So there's the school, which is one way of learning. Then there's a self-directed learning setting, which is a different way of learning, and then there's home education, which is another way of learning, and there's this, and that you could see different ways of learning right in front of you, rather than it simply being, everybody goes to school, so inclusivity means everybody goes to school. Because what I've seen happening in inclusive practice is often it just means we have to tweak things so that these children who aren't really happy in the school setting are a bit more happy. So we keep them in there. Do you see what I mean? It never seems to work radically. It never seems to work as, okay, how could we make this setting really inclusive for everybody? Well, that would mean massively increasing the level of autonomy for all kids, for example. It would mean the interventions that we bring in for these kids, well, we need to bring them in for everybody, because that's what real inclusion is. So there's never a kind of feedback. I think that's what I feel is wrong. We're missing that bit where we're like, okay, it doesn't work for these kids, so let's restructure it for everybody. Instead, it's going to stay as it is. We'll put these little extra things in for you, like you can go and have a movement break, or you can have a wobble cushion because you're different. I know that doesn't address your whole question, but
it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also having those options open to people, because often special schools and specialist schools, and I've gone through the process of getting children into specialist schools, it is the longest fight of some for some parents it feels like a massive fight to be able to access the right to education.
Absolutely.
A lot of children aren't receiving an education because they are stopped from going to these schools because they're not severe enough, or they haven't got this plan, or they haven't got this paperwork. And I feel like the UK needs to change that shift into being able to offer different types of education. I think I massively agree with what you said, and that was really interesting. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm aware that we need to end because Kat is saying we've got the next session starting. So thank you all very much. Do come and follow me on Twitter. You can ask other questions there, and a lot of what I've talked about is in my book. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you all today.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.